This is the most futuristic warship ever put to sea. $8 billion. A hull so angular and stealthy that on radar, a ship the length of 2 football fields looks like a small fishing boat. And mounted on its bow, 2 enormous guns. The largest naval guns designed since the battleships of World War II. There's just one problem. Those guns have no ammunition. None. Not a single shell. And it's not because they ran out. It's because the Navy stopped buying the ammunition after each shell ended up costing nearly $1 million. More than a cruise missile. So the most advanced surface warship America ever built sails the ocean with 2 giant guns it cannot fire, built around a weapon it can't use. How does that happen? How do you spend $8 billion on a warship and end up with guns that shoot nothing? The answer isn't stupidity, it's something stranger, and far more revealing about how modern weapons really live and die.
To understand the guns, you have to go back to the 1990s, to a Navy with a strange new problem. The Soviet Union was gone. The great enemy fleet the US had built itself to fight had simply disappeared. So the question became, what should the next American destroyer actually do? The answer they landed on was supporting troops ashore. For decades, that job had belonged to battleships. Floating fortresses that could sit off a coastline and hammer targets inland with huge guns, supporting Marines as they landed. But the last battleships were being retired. Something had to replace that firepower. And the Navy wanted to replace it cheaply. Because the alternative, hitting land targets with Tomahawk cruise missiles, cost over $1 million per shot.
You can't fight a sustained battle firing million-dollar missiles all day. What they wanted was a gun. A ship that could park off the coast and rain down precise guided shells at a fraction of the cost of a missile, all day long for days. That was the dream. A next-generation destroyer built around a next-generation gun. And they designed the entire ship, every system, to serve it.
And here's what has to be said clearly because it matters for the whole story. The Zumwalt is not a bad ship. In pure engineering, it's astonishing. That radical inverted hull, wider below the waterline than above, slices through the sea and slashes the ship's radar signature down to something the size of a fishing boat, on a vessel over 600 feet long. It runs on an integrated electric power system generating around 58 megawatts, enough to power the entire ship and, in theory, future weapons like railguns or lasers. It's so automated that it needs a crew of about 95 sailors, where an older destroyer needed 300. This is genuinely next-generation naval engineering.
Stealth, electric power, automation. Years ahead of anything else on the water. None of what went wrong is because the ship was crude or the people building it were foolish. Every part of that is important to hold on to, because the failure that's coming isn't a failure of engineering at all. It's a failure of arithmetic. And it starts with the gun the whole ship was built around.
Let's look at that gun, because the entire Zumwalt was designed to serve it. It's called the Advanced Gun System, the AGS. Each Zumwalt carries 2 of them on its bow, and they are massive, 155mm guns, the biggest naval guns designed since World War II. Each one hides inside a stealth housing, the whole barrel enclosed so it stays invisible to radar until the moment it fires. Behind each gun sits a fully automated magazine, designed to hold over 300 shells, feeding the gun with no human hauling ammunition. It could fire around 10 rounds a minute and hurl a guided shell to targets roughly 80 miles away. A single Zumwalt was meant to deliver the sustained firepower of an entire battery of Army artillery from safely offshore. But here's the critical design decision. the one that becomes the whole story. The AGS was built to fire exactly one type of ammunition. 1. A special guided shell designed specifically for this gun and nothing else. The magazines were even shaped precisely for that one round. So follow the chain. The ship was built around the gun, and the gun was built around a single shell. Everything, $8 billion of warship, ultimately rested on one custom projectile, one point of failure. And when that one shell went wrong, there was no backup. There couldn't be.
That one shell was called the LRLAP, the Long Range Land Attack Projectile. And on paper, it was brilliant. A rocket-assisted, GPS-guided shell that could fly over 100 kilometers and land within 50 meters of its target. Precision artillery fired from the sea from a gun the size of a small building. And here's the part people always get wrong about this story. The shell worked. It was tested. It flew. It hit its targets. There was no great technical failure, no fatal flaw in the design. Engineers who worked on it said there were no significant performance problems at all. The LRLAP did everything it was supposed to do. Except one thing. It was supposed to be affordable. Back in 2004, the target price for each shell was around $35,000. Reasonable for a guided round. Cheaper than a missile, exactly as intended. That was the whole point of the gun. Cheap, sustained, precise firepower. But by the time the ship was in the water, that price had not crept up. It had exploded. Each shell was now going to cost between $800,000 and $1 million. Not $35,000, nearly $1 million for a single shot. How does a $35,000 shell become $1 million shell when nothing about the shell itself went wrong? For that, you have to understand the cruelest math in the entire defense world.
The answer is economies of scale, and it's the heart of this whole story. When you develop a weapon like the LRLAP, an enormous amount of the cost is fixed up front. The research, the engineering, the factory tooling, the whole production line. That cost exists whether you build 1,000 shells or 10. To make each shell cheap, you have to spread that huge fixed cost across a huge number of rounds. And the original plan did exactly that. The Navy was going to build 32 Zumwalts, each carrying magazines for hundreds of shells. That's thousands upon thousands of rounds. Spread the development cost across all of those, and each shell comes out cheap, around that $35,000 target. But then the program got cut. 32 ships became 7, 7 became 3, and here's the trap. The fixed development cost didn't shrink with it. That whole mountain of cost now had to be spread across the tiny number of shells needed for just 3 ships.
Divide the same huge cost by a fraction of the rounds, and the price per shell goes vertical. As one Navy official put it, the small number of ships killed the affordable round. And that's how you arrive at the punchline. Each shell now cost nearly $1 million, as much as a Tomahawk cruise missile. But a Tomahawk flies over 1,000 miles, not 80, and hits harder. So why would you ever fire $1 million shell that goes 80 miles when the same money buys a missile that goes 1,000? You wouldn't. The gun's entire reason to exist, cheap firepower, was gone. So in 2016, the Navy made the only decision the math allowed. It canceled the shell. It stopped buying the LRLAP entirely. And that left the Zumwalt in one of the strangest positions any warship has ever been in. The guns were still there, 2 per ship, 6 across the whole class of 3. Enormous, sophisticated, fully installed, and completely useless because there was nothing to load into them. Various replacement rounds were proposed. Maybe another shell could be adapted. Maybe a hypervelocity projectile from the railgun program. But the magazines were shaped for that one specific round, and none of the alternatives ever made it into service. The guns stayed empty. The most advanced naval gun system ever built had become, in the words of one report, a pair of very expensive sculptures. Beautiful, stealthy, precise, and silent. Forever. Think about where that left the ship. The Zumwalt was designed from the keel up around these guns. That was its mission: shore bombardment, cheap, sustained fire. And now the mission was impossible, because the weapon at the center of it could never fire a shot. An $8 billion warship built around a purpose it could no longer perform. A ship in search of a reason to exist. But the story doesn't end with a useless ship. Because the Navy did something clever, it stopped trying to save the guns and started trying to save the ship. Starting in 2024, the Navy began physically removing the advanced gun systems from the Zumwalts. The very weapons the entire ship was built around, cut out and taken away. And in the space where those guns used to sit, they're installing launch tubes for hypersonic missiles, weapons that fly at more than 5 times the speed of sound, able to strike targets far faster and farther than any gun ever could. And here's the twist inside the twist. All that engineering that seemed wasted, the stealth, the massive electric power plant, the automation, turns out to be perfect for this new role. A stealthy ship that can sneak close, with enormous power to spare and space where the guns used to be, is an almost ideal platform for hypersonic weapons. So the Zumwalt is being reborn. Not as the gun-armed shore bombardment ship it was designed to be, but as one of the most advanced hypersonic strike ships in the world. The mission it was built for died. A new one that nobody planned came to take its place. The ship that had no reason to exist finally found one, by throwing away the very thing it was built around.
So what's the real lesson of the Zumwalt? It's tempting to call it a failure, a boondoggle, proof that the military wastes money. But that misses what actually happened, and the truth is more useful. Nothing here failed the way you'd expect. The ship's engineering was brilliant. The gun worked. The shell worked. No enemy touched it. No system broke. What killed the gun was a spreadsheet. When the order dropped from 32 ships to 3, the economics that made the whole plan sensible collapsed and took the affordable shell down with it. That's the real lesson, and it runs through all of modern warfare. Scale is a weapon. A design that's brilliant at 32 ships can become worthless at 3, not because the design got worse, but because the math underneath it changed. Cost per unit isn't a detail. It can decide whether a weapon lives or dies. It's why the Navy went back to building its proven Arleigh Burke destroyers in large numbers, instead of a handful of exquisite, one-of-a-kind ships. The same lesson we keep seeing everywhere, with cheap drones against expensive warships, with unmanned submarines. The side that gets the arithmetic right usually wins. And the Zumwalt is the $8 billion reminder of what happens when the arithmetic gets away from you. Where does that leave the Zumwalt today? Oddly enough, in a better place than it's been in years. 3 ships, no longer waiting for a shell that will never come, being rebuilt around the fastest weapons the Navy has ever fielded. The guns are gone. The dream of cheap shore bombardment is over. But the ship itself, that impossible stealth hull, that ocean of electric power, is finally being used for something it can actually do. It took losing its entire original purpose for the Zumwalt to find a real one. It's a strange kind of success, born from a very expensive failure. And it only happened because the Navy was willing to admit the original plan was dead and adapt, instead of pouring more money into guns that would never fire. So, how does the most advanced warship ever built end up with guns it can't fire? Not through stupidity, not through some dramatic technical failure. The ship was a marvel. The gun was the biggest since the battleships. The shell flew true and hit its targets. It all came apart for one reason. The price of a single shell climbed from $35,000 to nearly $1 million. Not because the shell changed, but because the number of ships collapsed, and there was no longer any way to make it cheap. A weapon that worked perfectly was defeated by a spreadsheet. That's the quiet, uncomfortable truth the Zumwalt teaches. In modern war, a weapon doesn't have to be beaten by the enemy to be beaten. It doesn't even have to fail. Sometimes it's killed by nothing more than arithmetic, the simple, brutal math of how many you were willing to build.